It was a crisp Monday afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one of the busiest in the country. Travelers bustled through the terminals, wheeling luggage and scanning departure boards, each person caught in the whirlwind of modern air travel. Among them walked Charles Ellis, a well-dressed African-American man in his early 50s. He wore a dark navy suit, perfectly tailored, and polished leather shoes that clicked softly against the tile floor. In one hand, he pulled a sleek black carry-on, in the other, he held his first-class boarding pass. Charles moved with calm purpose, standing tall at 6 feet, with a quiet dignity that drew glances not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself like someone who had nothing to prove. The silver cufflinks on his shirt shimmered under the fluorescent lights, and his wedding band, worn in gold, spoke of decades of commitment. He wasn't a celebrity or a VIP in the traditional sense, but there was something about him that suggested he was a man of principle, perhaps someone who had seen a lot, yet still met the world with composure. As the boarding announcement echoed through the concourse, now boarding first-class passengers, Charles stepped forward. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, who offered a courteous nod and scanned it without issue. With a polite smile, Charles thanked her and made his way down the jet bridge. His gait was steady, unhurried. Inside the plane, the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. The first-class cabin was peaceful, its plush leather seats gleaming under soft lighting. Charles placed his bag in the overhead bin above seat 2A, then eased into the wide seat by the window. He let out a quiet sigh as he loosened his tie, pulled out a leather-bound book from his bag, something classic, and settled in. Outside, the chaos of the terminal faded away. For now, everything felt calm, orderly. Little did he know, that calm was about to be tested in a way no one on that flight could have imagined. Charles Ellis had just begun to relax into the plush first-class seat when the voice of a flight attendant broke the stillness. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone sharp and clipped. Charles looked up from his book to see a tall woman in her mid-40s, dressed immaculately in a navy blue uniform. Her name tag read Linda. Her posture was stiff, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't smile. There was no courtesy in her expression, only suspicion. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," she added, holding out her hand. Charles raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised but cooperative. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and handed over the neatly folded boarding pass. Linda took it and glanced at it briefly before frowning. Her lips tightened, and she returned the pass to him almost dismissively. "This doesn't look right," she said with a shake of her head. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" Charles responded calmly, his voice steady. "Yes, I'm in 2A. That's what the ticket says." But Linda was already turning away, muttering something under her breath as she walked briskly toward the galley at the front of the cabin. A few nearby passengers exchanged curious glances, sensing something was off. Charles remained seated, his demeanor unchanged, though a hint of tension flickered behind his composed expression. Moments later, Linda returned, clearly flustered. Her steps were quick and forceful. She stopped at Charles's seat, her voice louder this time. "I checked the system," she said. "And there seems to be a mistake. I'm going to need you to move to economy." Charles blinked slowly, then sat up straighter. "There is no mistake," he said. "You saw my ticket. This is my seat." Linda's patience seemed to evaporate. "Sir, I'm not asking," she said. "You need to gather your belongings and move. If you don't, I'll have to involve airport security." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers nearby turned their heads. Some shifted in their seats. A few quietly reached for their phones. Charles didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his voice low but firm. "Feel free to call whoever you need." The battle lines had quietly been drawn, and the cabin of that airplane would soon become a stage for something far bigger than a seating dispute. Charles Ellis remained seated, his spine straight against the leather of seat 2A, the boarding pass still in hand as if it might offer protection from what was quickly becoming an uncomfortable scene. Around him, murmurs had begun to ripple. First-class passengers, mostly business travelers and retirees headed west, shifted in their seats, whispering beneath their breath. Linda, the flight attendant, returned to his row with a look of finality in her eyes. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tight. She stood rigidly, as if preparing for confrontation. "Sir," she said, now louder, drawing even more attention from the surrounding rows, "you are holding up the boarding process. I need you to move to the back of the plane. Now." Charles looked up at her, calm but resolute. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat." "It's printed right here," he said, gently holding up the ticket. She didn't budge. "I've checked the system, and there's no record of you being assigned this seat. Either you move, or I call security. Those are your options." There was a pause, just a beat, but it felt like time froze. You could almost hear the engines humming outside the plane as passengers braced themselves for what might come next. "I won't be moving," Charles said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You're welcome to call security if that's what you feel is necessary." The way he said it, so collected, so firm, seemed to disarm the moment for just a second. But then, Linda turned on her heel and marched toward the front of the aircraft. She passed a man across the aisle, who by now had discreetly raised his phone and hit record. Around Charles, people exchanged knowing glances. Some were sympathetic. Others simply uncomfortable. No one spoke. When Linda reappeared a moment later, she wasn't alone. A supervisor followed behind her, a tablet in hand and concern etched into his expression. He approached Charles slowly, like someone walking into a room already filled with gasoline and looking for the match. "Sir," he said calmly, "we've had a report of a seating issue. May I please verify your boarding pass?" Charles handed it over again without hesitation. This wasn't about seating anymore. It was about dignity. And for everyone watching, that truth was starting to settle in. The cabin had grown tense, thick with silence as the supervisor stood next to Charles Ellis's seat, tablet in hand. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with graying hair, glasses perched low on his nose, and a demeanor that suggested years of experience in high-stress situations. His badge read Mark Hastings, and unlike Linda, his approach was calm and measured. "Mr. Ellis, thank you for your patience," Mark said, scrolling through the flight manifest on his screen. "Let me take another look here." Charles handed over his boarding pass once again, still calm, still respectful. Passengers leaned in slightly, hoping for resolution. The recording phone across the aisle was still active, discreet, but very much rolling. Mark studied the pass, compared it to the digital manifest, then tapped the screen a few more times. After a pause, he nodded, his brow relaxing. "Everything appears to be in perfect order," he said, finally looking up. "You are, in fact, assigned to seat 2A. There's no mistake." A collective breath seemed to move through the first-class cabin. Relief, validation, and perhaps a quiet sense of vindication settled into the air. Linda, still standing stiffly to the side, frowned. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tight. "Because I checked earlier in." Mark cut her off gently but firmly. "Yes, I'm sure. His name and seat number match our records exactly. There's no error here." Charles gave a small nod. That's what I've been saying all along." Mark turned toward Linda and lowered his voice just slightly, enough to remain professional but make a point. "Let's focus on finishing boarding and keeping the cabin calm. The flight's already delayed." Linda's cheeks flushed with color, and she nodded curtly before retreating toward the galley. Her expression, however, wasn't apologetic. It was resentful. Back in his seat, Charles calmly returned to his book, though his eyes lingered for a moment on the other passengers. Some smiled at him. A few nodded subtly, acknowledging what had just transpired. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. But the flight was far from peaceful, and as the jet engines prepared for takeoff, so too did the slow burn of something much deeper than a seating mix-up. The cabin had returned to a low hum of conversation, but the tension lingered like humidity before a summer storm. Charles Ellis remained seated in 2A, quietly flipping through his book. Though his posture was relaxed, the atmosphere around him was anything but. In the row across from him sat a younger woman named Danielle, no older than 30, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a denim jacket. She'd been recording the earlier confrontation with a steady hand and a sense of purpose. Like many passengers, she had watched it all unfold, from the initial accusation to the supervisor's confirmation that Charles belonged exactly where he was. But what struck her most wasn't just the mistake, it was how it had been handled. Now, as Linda returned down the aisle once again, her jaw set, eyes fixed forward, Danielle felt a line had been crossed. "Sir," Linda said sharply as she stopped at Charles's row yet again, "I need to remind you that it's my job to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. If you continue to cause disruption, I will escalate this further." Charles looked up slowly, his voice calm as ever. "Ma'am, I haven't caused any disruption. I've simply remained in my assigned seat." Before Linda could respond, Danielle stood up. "Excuse me," Danielle said, her voice clear and firm, "but he hasn't done anything wrong. We've all seen it. You're the one creating the scene." The effect was immediate. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled across the cabin like the wave at a ballpark. Linda's face flushed deep red. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped. "Oh, it does now," Danielle replied, holding up her phone slightly. "I've been recording the entire exchange. And trust me, your airline isn't going to like what they see." Gasps and murmurs followed. A couple in row 3 exchanged knowing looks, while a man in the back leaned into the aisle, now openly watching. For the first time, Linda seemed rattled. She turned abruptly and walked back toward the galley without another word. Charles said nothing. He didn't have to. The tide had turned. And somewhere in that quiet cabin, the balance of power had shifted, not through shouting, but through calm resistance and the courage of a single voice that refused to stay silent. Back in the galley, Linda paced like a caged animal. The confrontation had not gone the way she expected. She had assumed her authority would be respected, unquestioned. Instead, she now found herself the subject of scrutiny, from her supervisor, from passengers, and, more alarmingly, from a video spreading beyond the walls of that plane. Her grip tightened around a plastic water cup. The murmurs coming from the cabin were no longer hushed. Passengers weren't just whispering, they were talking, openly, questioning her actions. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We ask that you please remain in your assigned seats and allow our crew to complete the boarding process without interruption. Thank you for your cooperation." It was a neutral-sounding announcement, but to those who had witnessed the earlier conflict, the message was clear: the captain was aware and watching. Moments later, Mark Hastings, the supervisor, appeared in the galley. His voice was low but firm. "Linda, he said, "this has gone far enough. The situation with Mr. Ellis is resolved. His seat is confirmed. There's no reason to escalate further." "But he made me look incompetent," she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. "Now there's a passenger recording me, passengers talking behind my back, and..." Mark cut her off with a glance that silenced her. "This isn't about how you feel," he said flatly. "The more you push this, the worse it gets for you. I've already spoken with the captain, and ground control has been notified. Stand down." "That's not a request." Linda stared at him, stunned. Her mouth opened to protest, but no words came. The weight of the situation settled in like a lead blanket. She finally nodded, stiffly, and turned away, retreating to the galley as ordered. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured another cup of water, trying to steady herself. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers watched in near silence as she disappeared behind the curtain. The mood was heavy, uncertain. No one was sure what might happen next. Charles, still in seat 2A, resumed reading his book, but even then, his quiet posture held the strength of a man who knew the truth was finally rising above the noise. The descent into Denver was smooth, but the tension in the cabin hadn't eased. Passengers sat upright, seatbelts fastened, belongings tucked beneath seats as the aircraft approached the runway. The usual pre-landing rustle, the zipping of carry-ons, clinks of tray tables, was oddly subdued. Everyone was waiting, but not just for touchdown. Charles Ellis remained composed, seated quietly in 2A. He had said little since the earlier confrontation, but his presence had become a quiet anchor of dignity amid the turbulence of human behavior. Across the aisle, Danielle, the passenger who had spoken up and recorded the incident, continued typing rapidly on her phone, sharing updates, no doubt, with an audience far beyond the cabin walls. In the galley, Linda sat perched on the small jump seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her earlier confidence had vanished. She barely blinked as the captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver. Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop at the gate." As the wheels kissed the tarmac and the plane slowed, Linda spotted two uniformed airline representatives waiting just outside the jet bridge. Her heart sank. Within minutes, the cabin doors opened. Passengers began retrieving bags and easing into the aisle. But Linda didn't move. Mark Hastings, the supervisor, appeared beside her. "Linda," he said quietly, "they're here for you." She stood, smoothing her uniform as though it might restore a sense of control. The airline reps approached. "Miss Carter," one said, using her last name with the kind of formal tone reserved for serious matters, "we need to speak with you in private regarding today's events." Passengers noticed. Whispers passed like wind through a wheat field. Eyes followed Linda as she stepped off the plane, escorted silently down the jet bridge. At the gate, in a small meeting room just beyond the terminal, Linda was informed she was being placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. The words were firm, direct, and left no room for debate. Back on the plane, Charles waited until most passengers had deboarded. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he was greeted with a very different tone. "Mr. Ellis," a senior airline official said respectfully, "we'd like to speak with you, privately. And we want to start by saying, we're sorry." By the next morning, the flight was no longer just a travel memory, it had become national news. The video, captured by Danielle on her phone, had made its rounds across social media platforms overnight. It was barely 4 minutes long, but it packed a powerful punch, a calm, black gentleman being wrongly accused and harassed while seated in first class. The moment Linda raised her voice, the quiet defiance of Charles Ellis, and the intervention of a brave passenger, all caught on camera, clear as day. Major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines blazed across screens: airline faces accusations of racial bias after viral flight incident, and first-class passenger harassed by flight attendant. Video sparks national outrage. By lunchtime, the footage had been viewed over 2 million times. The public reaction was swift and severe. Phone lines at the airline's customer service center were overwhelmed. Their official social media accounts were flooded with thousands of comments, many from older Americans who expressed their anger and disappointment. Some shared stories of their own experiences with travel discrimination, while others called for accountability. "I've flown with this airline for over 20 years, one comment read on Facebook. But after seeing how Mr. Ellis was treated, I'm done." In retirement communities and family dining rooms, the story became the talk of the day. Cable news channels aired roundtable discussions, with commentators analyzing frame by frame how Linda's actions spiraled, and how Charles never once raised his voice. At the airline's headquarters, a crisis team had been assembled overnight. Executives reviewed the footage in a somber conference room. There were no excuses to be made. What the world had seen was clear. The CEO issued a preliminary statement by mid-afternoon. "We are deeply sorry for the unacceptable treatment of one of our passengers. We are reviewing the incident and taking swift action to ensure accountability and lasting change." But for many, it wasn't enough. The public wanted more than words. They wanted proof that the airline understood what had happened, that it wasn't just a PR issue, but a cultural reckoning. And as Charles Ellis sat in his office that afternoon, fielding media inquiries and messages of support, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. Just 3 days after Flight 472 landed, the airline announced its decision. Linda Carter had been officially terminated. The statement was brief but firm. It acknowledged that her behavior violated multiple internal policies, failed to meet the airline's standards of professionalism, and did not reflect the values we expect from our team members. While her name wasn't included in the press release, the public already knew, and many believed it was the right call. Linda, now back at her apartment, sat on the edge of her sofa in stunned silence. Her phone had stopped buzzing. Friends had grown quiet. She scrolled through the news headlines on her tablet: flight attendant fired after viral incident. Passengers' calm response sparks industry-wide review. The weight of it all settled on her chest. For years, she'd prided herself on discipline and structure. But in one moment of misjudgment, fueled by unconscious bias and a refusal to back down, everything unraveled. Meanwhile, Charles Ellis was navigating a very different world. What began as a simple business trip had become a national conversation. People from all walks of life were reaching out to him: veterans, school teachers, retirees, thanking him for standing his ground with dignity. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. But now that it was here, he was determined to use it for good. At the airline's request, he met with senior leadership in a quiet downtown office building. He didn't come with demands, he came with vision. He spoke of the importance of training that went beyond checklists, of teaching employees to recognize bias before it becomes policy. If you want to earn back trust, he told the CEO directly, you need more than a diversity seminar. You need cultural humility. You need to listen. His words struck a chord. Soon after, the airline created a passenger advisory council. Charles was offered a seat at the table. He accepted, not for recognition, but because he understood the power of lived experience. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about others who had been silently dismissed, and about ensuring they wouldn't be again. Through quiet strength and steady conviction, Charles had become more than a wrong traveler, he had become a catalyst for change. Weeks later, Charles Ellis boarded another flight, this time, with the same airline. As he approached the gate, he noticed subtle but meaningful changes. Staff members greeted passengers with genuine eye contact and respect. The energy was different. It wasn't just surface-level courtesy, it felt intentional. When Charles stepped into the first-class cabin, he was welcomed warmly by a flight attendant who clearly recognized him, though said nothing more than, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellis. Please let us know if there's anything you need." Charles nodded, took his seat, and settled in. As the plane pushed back from the gate, he looked out the window, not with apprehension, but with quiet reflection. This flight was uneventful, smooth from takeoff to landing. But beneath the calm exterior, something had shifted. Not just in the airline, but in the national conversation. Across the country, other companies had begun re-examining their policies. News outlets followed up with thoughtful commentary on unconscious bias, accountability, and the power of civility in the face of injustice. Church groups, civic organizations, and even retirement communities hosted discussions about what had happened and what it meant. At the airline's headquarters, the newly formed Passenger Advisory Council held its first meeting. Charles sat among a diverse group of voices: veterans, single moms, retirees, community leaders, all there to ensure passengers would be treated with fairness and humanity going forward. His presence wasn't symbolic. It was foundational. And as for Linda, she had disappeared from public view. In the privacy of her own reckoning, she was forced to confront truths she had long ignored. Whether she would grow from it remained to be seen. But the opportunity for growth was there. This story, born from tension in a narrow aluminum tube 35,000 feet in the air, had landed squarely in the hearts of millions. For Charles, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring something too often taken for granted: dignity. For the airline, it was a painful but necessary reckoning that forced real, measurable change. And for the many watching, especially those in their later years who had seen the world change many times before, it was a reminder that even now, justice is possible. That integrity matters. And that one calm voice, when paired with truth, can echo far beyond the aisle of an airplane. Some of the most powerful lessons in life don't come from grand speeches or polished campaigns, they come from quiet moments of truth. What happened to Charles Ellis on Flight 472 wasn't just about a seat or a policy, it was about respect, courage, and the dignity every human being deserves, no matter their background. For those of us who've lived long enough to see both the progress and the setbacks of society, this story serves as a powerful reminder: injustice doesn't always arrive in loud, obvious ways. Sometimes, it shows up in subtle glances, assumptions, or silence in the face of wrongdoing. But what gives this story its weight is how it was met, not with rage, but with calm resolve. Charles never raised his voice. He never lashed out. He stood firm, grounded in truth and self-respect. That's a lesson we can all carry with us, especially in a world where shouting often drowns out listening. Sometimes, the most powerful way to speak is by standing still and standing tall. Another key message lies in the response of the people around him. One passenger had the courage to speak up. Others followed. That moment of solidarity reminds us that change is often sparked not by crowds, but by individuals who choose to do the right thing. Whether we're in a grocery store, at church, or simply observing everyday life, we all have the ability to make someone feel seen, heard, and valued. And finally, there's the lesson of accountability and growth. The airline didn't just issue an apology, they made structural changes. It's proof that admitting mistakes doesn't make us weaker, it makes us wiser, if we're willing to learn from them. At this stage of life, many of us reflect on legacy. What kind of world are we leaving behind? Stories like this offer hope. Hope that dignity still matters. That standing for what's right, even in silence, can ripple outward. And that grace, paired with conviction, can move mountains, even at 35,000 feet. So, wherever your next journey takes you, whether by plane or through the quiet corridors of daily life, carry these lessons with you. They don't weigh much, but they'll take you far.